Hello, welcome to Wheat from the Chaff on the Farmgate podcast channel. I'm FFINLO COSTAIN, the chief editor of 8.9.com.
And I'm Joe Stanley, farmer, writer and head of sustainable farming at the Allerton project.
Now, we've got a packed schedule today. We're going to be talking about the expiration of countryside stewardship agreements on 4,500 farms, and in particular what that means for Joe at the Allerton project. We're going to talk about the need for positive and unifying stories in a national landscape where there's so much grimness. And we're joined for the programme by the fabulous OCHOTA, the president of CPRE. Marianne, just say hello and tell us who you are.
Hello, it's a real privilege to be joining you, FFINLO and Joe. Thanks so much. There's so much to talk about, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And later in the programme, we're going to be talking, of course, about all things CPRE, planning, rural development, home building, solar farming. And we'll look at CPRE's unique role as an NGO and whether the organisation, which has, well, frankly, so many useful things to say about farming, can shake its reputation for NIMBYism. But for now, let's start with kids on farms. Now, Joe, a couple of months ago, you wrote an article for Farmers Weekly, which was talking, not unreasonably, about whether it was safe for kids to be working on farms, the sort of things they should be doing there, and just sort of raising the issue. And then again, this week, you've written a follow-up to that article, and I'm just going to read out a couple of the things that you said. I mean, essentially, the article was sort of headed, do we really want defensive noise to drown out self-analysis? You said, in August, I wrote a piece intended to initiate a conversation about the role of young children on farms and their safety. The response was, in some quarters, deeply dispiriting. Rather than engage with the question, a chorus of outrage and personal attacks was unleashed on social media. We must cultivate instead a culture of curiosity, humility, and responsibility. Give us some of the background on this, Joe.
Thanks, FFINLO. Yeah, look, I've touched on this subject before in some of my articles, and it's never gone down well. I appreciate that, you know, it's a really nuanced, difficult subject to talk about having children on farms, because farms aren't workplaces. They're also, well, they're not just workplaces, they're also homes. So this is a really complex subject. But really, I was just making 2 points in the original article, which is one, safety. We have young children killed every single year on farms, and clearly there is an issue there around safety, whether they're just playing and interacting on the farmyard or whether they're working as young children on those farms. There's an issue there, right? And secondly, I guess the point I was also making was, having children working on farms, often working, during school holidays, working full weeks, working adult hours, working 50, 60, 70 hours a week in adult jobs. Is that something that we should be allowing to continue as an industry? Is that something that we should just be sort of just accepting as the status quo without ever really giving it any thought? So that original piece, FFINLO, was really, again, accepting that this is a really difficult issue, but also saying, look, we should have the ability to talk about this. Let's have a conversation.
And just, for the sake of the conversation, Joe, define what you mean by a child.
I mean, it's legal for a 13-year-old to drive a tractor and do, again, an adult's job on a farm. From 16, you can drive one on the road. But of course, many children are working on farms much younger than that. And of course, mostly those kids really want to work on those farms. But again, it's not really up to the kids to decide, what is a good situation in any given farm. And again, I can imagine people are kind of screaming at their radio at this point and sort of, really, I mean, again, the feet, look, I'm not saying that I've got all the answers to this or that, I am necessarily even correct in my analysis of the situation, but we've got to be able to have a conversation with this. And I think that the second piece you referred to there, FFINLO, it was really me saying that on difficult issues such as this, and it's not just all about this issue, it's about other things such as the whole transition that we have as an industry towards, a future footing. We need to be able to have difficult conversations without them just descending into vitriolic and auto-reflexive, just defensiveness.
I mean, I think, you mentioned there the legal situation, and I think that's something that we should just dwell on for a moment, because there's opinion about whether kids should be able to work on farms or not. And then there's the legal situation, isn't there? So just to sort of clarify what's allowed, what is allowed is family help. And children are often able to help with light tasks, which means, maybe collecting the eggs, helping sort of, milk the goat or something like that. But the minimum age for actually doing any kind of real work as such is, as you say, 13. When I'm looking this up, it says that light work is sort of feeding smaller animals, collecting eggs, helping with vegetables, that sort of stuff. What isn't allowed is kids using machinery, so tractors, harvesters, chainsaws. Can you imagine a 3-year-old with a chainsaw, or work with dangerous chemicals? And again, as you suggest, it limits the amount of time that kids can spend, helping out during school days or weekends. And I'm sort of aware of this. There was a time when my wife was doing a few hours in the local shop, and the kids just weren't allowed to go in and help. They couldn't go and volunteer because there was the danger that they were going to be seen as being employed. And obviously when they became 13, there was a slightly different set of rules. They could do a couple of hours, but before that it was an absolute no. On obviously after 16, as you say, there's a lot more freedom. So just,
can I come in on this?
Yeah, please, Marianne, do.
So I think, obviously, when we're talking about 8-year-olds or 9-year-olds, there's probably more consensus that there are obvious and sensible limits to what a child should or shouldn't be doing on farm. But I think the real grey areas and the bits where Joe has experienced a really vitriolic kind of pushback, that we don't even want to have this conversation. And I agree, Joe, that's completely a problem. And you'll probably get pushback for that too, but it's really courageous to call it out. I think the real issue, the grey area, is at that point where you're 13. So it is legal. It's not a question about legality. It's a question of ethics, values, genuine dynamic risk assessment. And the bottom line is that farms are not places that are as safe as they should be, and that there is a kind of a broader sense that, well, these things happen, but we've had 18 people die on farms since April. That's not normal, that's not appropriate, and there's 18 families and communities who are devastated by those tragedies. And I think it's the broader mindset. And actually, if you kind of did the thought experiment and said, well, hang on a minute, if farming were as safe as other industries that use heavy machinery, that actually, implement really solid PPE plans, would you put your 13-year-old in full 5-point PPE to then go and work with a telehandler? And actually, if you say, well, I wouldn't send them onto a construction site at 13, maybe you should be asking the same question about sending them out onto the yard in the dark, wearing green and brown clothes, hoping for the best, because that is genuinely what you're doing. And it's true of that youngster who's 13, but it's probably also true of your contractors and of your family members or other people that you're working with who are 22 or 52. When those wellies are empty because someone's died, I mean, it's a tragedy regardless of the age, right? And they are preventable.
And to be clear, it's, you're quite right that grey area exists around that sort of 12, 13, 14 sort of area. But there are a lot of younger kids who are, doing stuff, helping out quite significantly on farms at different times, aren't there? I mean, quite apart from anything else, this must invalidate insurance, so the farmers are really sort of exposing themselves to risk in that way. Joe, just sort of talk us through some of the vitriol that you experience, because I think, that would start us off nicely.
Look, I mean, I'm not going to. I'll be honest. I logged off all my social media accounts for the couple of weeks after this, because you just don't want to scroll through that stuff. I had enough people sort of contacting me saying, screenshots of things. Oh, have you seen this? But look, you could talk about sort of essentially what is trolling. And again, in the piece that's come out in the Farmers Weekly today, I wrote, for those people who disagreed with me but did so in a constructive manner, thank you. This is part of the conversation we need to have. But it's that just absolutely unstructured, rage. It was, what isn't helpful? Some of the sort of well-known figures that are now kind of across farming social media who, frankly, they whip up, Twitter storms because that is part of their model of being social media figures. You know, that is not, it's not helpful to anyone. It might generate likes and clicks, but it's not doing anything positive for the industry. But you know, I had enough people come up to me in real life and you know, say that they'd read such a piece, and again, even if they didn't necessarily completely agree with me, they thanked me for starting that conversation, for putting it out there. And you know, somebody needs to do that. So you know, I'm proud that I sort of, you know, that I made that intervention. Again, I've done it before. I think I'll continue to do it because this is an important issue. And as I said in that original article, you know, we used to think that sending children up chimneys, down mines, and under the spinning jenny was completely normal until all of a sudden it wasn't. And we just need to have the ability as an industry to have these moments of introspection without essentially making any breaking from the status quo something which scares people, so that we don't have those conversations as an industry. And that is not a healthy place to be.
And Joe, you talked about, you know, the social media response, the way in which people were lambasting you very often. And something I saw, you know, on LinkedIn this morning was a suggestion from one of the people that was following you, that actually it was from a lot of people that weren't remotely involved in farming. It wasn't farmers themselves. But did you get that kind of response from people you were actually meeting? Because you're president, aren't you, of your local NFU? I mean, were farmers that you knew coming and questioning the approach that you were taking?
No, I mean, to date, the messages I've received, you know, personal messages and personal interactions, real life interactions, have all been very positive. And I think, again, that tells you a lot about social media, frankly, which, again, Marianne, I'm sure, will be familiar with herself. And pretty much anyone who's on social media and expresses an opinion will no doubt be very familiar with.
I think a lot of the responsibility obviously needs to sit with the people who are being the keyboard warrior in that moment, with that kind of real immediate response that you wouldn't necessarily throw at someone if you were face to face. But I think the platforms need to, not the platform, but the publications need to take responsibility as well, because the way they frame these conversations is to provoke outrage, because there is a whole revenue stream in provoking outrage, because like you say, Joe, it's clicks, it's interactions, it's engagements. And you've got someone sitting in their communications and social media team going, oh, wait, this one's playing really well to the crowd. And actually, if their sensibilities, if their kind of targets are about engagements and clicks, rather than what is the quality of this conversation that we are convening, then publications like the Farming Press are doing a disservice to the industry and the communities that they're supposed to be serving. So they need to moderate the comments. They need to, you know, put the headlines in such a way that is possibly a bit less breathless. And come on, you should be outraged about this. You should have a strong opinion, and you should definitely share it with us in 4-letter words, because it doesn't do anyone any favours.
I agree, Maria. And in this particular case, exactly that did happen. You know, I was, you know, and I've had this conversation with Farmers Weekly, and, you know, I really, you know, value writing for Farmers Weekly, but I did have that exact conversation, which was, yes, their kind of approach to this particular piece did seem designed to whip up additional ill sentiment, which again drives traffic, and I understand that, but also it's not ultimately helpful to anyone, and certainly not to the industry.
And I guess it's partly sort of different views of free speech, isn't it? And I think that an awful lot of editors and social media channels really struggle with this idea of what is free speech. And of course, we're having this, you know, with the whole sort of reform and Trump sort of conversation at the moment, that free speech in and of itself, you know, there are limitations within it. And if you're just slagging people off and saying stuff without any factual basis and just being deliberately provocative, then that's, you know, it's not part of a nuanced conversation. It doesn't help anybody. Do you write your own headlines for Farmers Weekly, Joe, or do you write the articles and somebody else sticks a headline on?
Yeah, no. So that no, I do not write the headlines, and I wouldn't have written the headline that appeared over my original article, because it was you know, intentionally inflammatory.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just for the sake of, you know, because we're talking about this, just clarify your view. What is your view on, you know, what a 6-7-year-old should be able to do on a farm, what a 13-year-old should be able to do?
Look, and this is the difficulty, right? Farms are homes and they are workplaces, and there is never going to be a single answer for any given, there's not going to be a blanket answer, right? There's not. I grew up on a farm. It was a hugely valuable experience, right? But I just do feel that there is not enough thought given to what is sensible, and we see that reflected in annual death tolls of children on farms. We don't see children killed in any other workplace, and literally days after my piece came out, and as the Twitter storm was reaching its peak, another child was killed on a farm. It's every single incident is a huge tragedy for the people involved, for the families involved. The reason I care about this subject, I didn't used to care about this subject, but I lost a child myself. For some reason, I've then decided that this is something I'm, passionate about. I don't want anyone to go through that. That's where I'm coming at this from. And we just need to have better conversations about this. And if a single person, if a single farm business took the time to think about how they do things and maybe to slightly change how they do things in the future, then that's a success as far as I'm concerned.
And just to sort of round this off, Marianne, we're not talking, are we, for one moment about kids not going on to farms. Sort of in another part of Britain, we're talking about trying to get more kids from more schools, primary age and upwards, or even younger, out onto farms so they have a proper understanding of what goes on there. I guess, if we're talking about younger children, whether it's the children of the farmer or whether it's children coming in from the school with a, full risk assessment, I guess they should be doing roughly similar things.
Well, not necessarily, because as Joe rightly points out, the farms where those children are also their homes. The people that they're with are their family. And it's kind of one of the remarkable things about farms is that they are often family businesses, and family businesses where the kids are involved hands-on from a young age. And that's right. It shouldn't be a case of legislating to ban that beyond what controls and legal restrictions and limits that we have at the moment. But I think the point that Joe is rightly making is that the farming industry and farming families need to be confident enough to have this conversation, because otherwise you've got loads of people who feel incredibly uncomfortable and they're not brave enough to raise the conversation in their local branch of the NFU, in the pub, in wherever they're meeting, saying, hang on a minute, aren't they a bit young? Or are you sure they're all right to drive that 250 horsepower tractor on that massive arable field that's really far away with a slightly sketchy mobile phone signal? I mean, if you wouldn't do it on a construction industry and hand your kid, your teenager, over to people you do not know to do heavy and difficult and dangerous manual labour, then think twice about doing it on your own doorstep, because they're not more protected because they're going to get killed in the field next to the house. So I think it's a combination of, yes, it's as Joe said, there's no one right answer. There's no blanket rule. And I think anyone who's suggesting that that's what he's saying hasn't actually read what he's written. What you need to do is just have a really honest conversation with yourself. You don't even need to have it out loud, but be brave enough to go there and go, well, actually, what do I think? And if you've got teenagers at home who work on farm, talk to them. Because if they're smart and adult enough to drive the big machinery, they should be smart and adult enough to have this conversation. And then also think about, what are your safety measures on farm for all the people who are on farm, not just the youngsters, because that's the way that we actually tackle farm safety.
It's reminded me of there's the whole thing of, what do you do when you've got the kids and you need to look after them, and whether you have them with you working on the farm or whether you sort of find some other more extreme version of babysitting. And there's a family story across on the Isle of Man where there was, one of my ancestors, a farmer who was left looking after the baby, but he had to plough a field, and so stuck the baby in its sort of basket up on top of a standing stone, and then proceeded to plough the field, and then completely forgot about the baby, went home, and eventually went back and found it. It was perfectly okay, but obviously the spirits around the standing stones have been looking after it or something.
Sounds very Spartan.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, doesn't it, Joe?
That's I mean, my first job was on a farm. After I finished my GCSEs, I got a job picking potatoes. I grew up in Cheshire. And do we get a safety briefing? No. I get any. I just turned up and hoped for the best and was told, don't put your fingers in that bit because you won't have any fingers at the end of the day, which was fine, and don't fall off the trailer. Okay, but I mean, there is a kind of a sensible version of making. And then we dipped sheep, and I was just wearing shorts and trainers, and the kind of thing is. Yeah, we got away with it. The baby on the top of the standing stone, the kid tucked into the combine. Yeah, but that's not, that data point is not evidence that it's safe or sensible.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Certainly, I feel like the Four Yorkshiremen sketch is coming on because at least you had machinery when you were doing potato sorting. In my day, it was you were just sitting in a freezing cold barn doing it by hand. But anyway, there we go. So we move on to countryside stewardship and the cliff edge that's coming. 4,500 farms and an area of land akin to Greater London, Manchester, and Birmingham combined that are facing the expiration of countryside stewardship schemes. We're not going to talk about the generality of it. We're going to talk about the Allerton project. And Joe, and I want, because when we've talked about this with Martin Lyons, he isn't necessarily going to be changing that much of what he does. He won't be enhancing the land that's been in countryside stewardship, but he won't necessarily be going and sort of ploughing into those edges. I think that you're feeling differently at the Allerton project, Joe.
I think the Allerton project has always reflected essentially what is possible, right? We are a working farm that does an awful lot of scientific research. So as such, we always try to be as relevant as possible. And ultimately, the working farm has to make working farming decisions. So we are in the situation at the minute whereby our 5-year countryside stewardship scheme runs out in December, as thousands of others do across the country. And we're looking at essentially what we can continue to support from the farm going forwards. And there are things absolutely that we will leave in place. So awkward field corners, water course buffer strips, beetle banks. These are things which fulfill a regulatory role or take up so little space and are of such utility that we would leave them there. They don't interfere with the farming operations. But there are things that are going to, frankly, at this point, they are going to go. So our pollen and nectar areas, our low input unharvested cereal options, lenient grazing in pasture. And there are things that are going to be reduced. Things like winter birdseed plots and supplementary feeding of winter birds. Now, those areas are going to be reduced rather than got rid of because actually we have a game shoot on the estate. And that game shoot, as game shoots have always done, will continue to pay from its own pocket for the upkeep of options which benefit the shoot. But of course, as an awful lot of research at the Allerton project has demonstrated, essentially by maintaining winter birdseed mixtures to feed game birds through the winter, they will continue to feed farmland birds through the winter as well. So some things are going to go on current plans, some things will stay, and some things will be reduced. And reduced especially if we're talking about those winter birdseed plots, for example, going through the middle of a good arable field. Where they're being paid for at the minute to compensate us for not having crops on those best bits of the field, those plots will get moved to the edges of the fields, the worst bits of land.
I'm interested in the way that you frame that. You're talking about the way in which the Allerton project tries to work as a commercial farm, a research farm, which is absolutely understandable. But then it's how those decisions are taken in terms of what you do and how you manifest a normal farm, in inverted commas, on what's an experimental farm and how you make those decisions. So what you're choosing to do, is it purely coming down to the way that you perceive the commercial advantage or otherwise of particular bits of land, Joe?
So it's always a trade-off because, again, the unique thing about the Allerton project is it is a working farm with a research establishment attached to it. And we also have a shoot. You've kind of got three sometimes completely competing priorities going on there. Now, the important thing to mention on this particular issue is, the Allerton project actually, I'm told some 2/3 of the options that farmers can carry out on their farms today in the Agri-Environment Handbook come from research that we have carried out at the Allerton project or the wider Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust. We have had a huge impact leading the way on this in the last 35 years. How do we make those decisions? Obviously, we are a demonstration farm, but we are primarily a commercial farm. So for the last 35 years, we've been able to demonstrate that doing all this stuff is of commercial benefit to a farm. By having these winter bird seed mixes, by having these pollen and nectar areas, yes, they benefit the wider farming operation, but they also bring in their own income stream, which is great. So we can demonstrate the benefit of that. The problem comes, Finlo, when you're not being paid to deliver these nature things. Now, if we're talking about a water buffer strip on the edge of a field, which is fulfilling a regulatory compliance objective, that's a no-brainer. If you're talking about having lots of pollen and nectar areas across your farm or winter bird seed, frankly, having a thriving population of farmland birds on our farm does not directly benefit the bottom line of our farm. It's a nice to have. And that's the sad reality. That's why we are where we are, because there is no value attached to nature. So that is why the payments to date from both the European Union and then the English government have been so vital in ensuring that more and more farmers are taking up these options. Because fundamentally, if they're not going to provide a financial return to the farmer, most farmers are not in a financial position to be able to subsidize this from their own pocket. And that's the sad reality of where we are right now.
I just want to sort of drill into that very slightly before going across to Marianne. You sort of use that term that, those areas that don't interfere with the farming business. And you talked about the way that the birds and possibly the insects don't have a particular sort of capital advantage for the farm. And I'm just sort of reflecting on some films that I've been making for the Nature Friendly Network, Nature Friendly Farming Network in Scotland. And John Seed was one of the interviewees, and he talks about his beetle banks and the presence of beneficial insects and that sort of thing, meaning that he's having what he thinks is a sort of 15 to 25% yield bump as a result, that because of these nature interventions, there is a financial benefit to him and his farm. Are you not experiencing a similar thing?
I mean, ultimately, of course, having a thriving ecosystem on your farm is going to be beneficial to your farm, right? In the medium to long term, that is going to build resilience into your farm. And of course, it's especially easy to talk about beneficial insects because that reduces our use of pesticides. It increases the number of pollinators on the farm. Reality is, of course, if we're talking about pollinators, most grass crops and most arable crops don't actually require pollinators. This is more of it's an ecosystem service for society and for our wider landscape. Again, it's great to have as a farmer there, but if it's costing you £1,000 a hectare to establish and manage these pollen and nectar areas, but you're not getting any payment for that, and the benefit it will be returning to you, but it is incredibly intangible. It's very much based on what you've specifically got going on your farm in terms of a rotation. That's a hard sell to a farmer who, let's bear in mind, if you look at recent DEFRA statistics, most farms across the UK are losing money on agricultural production. Now, that's not a great, so you might then also say, Finland, well, why would you grow more food, right? If you're already losing money on it. Well, that's because farmers have got 70 years of muscle memory where, they will try and grow as much food as they possibly can across a landscape. And of course, by putting lots of lovely nature stuff across their farm, that reduces the efficiency in some cases of their farming operations. So again, taking things like winter birdseed mixes out of the middle of their best arable farm will be an obvious solution to them to try and improve essentially their food production. And yes, it's always incredibly uncertain what a farmer's going to get paid for their produce at the end of the year, but they will likely roll that dice and go, you know what, let's hope in 12 months this extra 10% of wheat I'm going to grow across this farm will be worth something, as opposed to doing stuff for nature, which I want to do. But if no one is going to pay for me to do that, and I can guarantee they're not going to pay for me to do that in the next 12 months, I'm going to take my chance with the farming.
Any particular thoughts, Marianne?
I mean, it's really interesting to hear Joe's kind of candid take. Fundamentally, I subscribe to the idea that what the Nature Friendly Farming Network stands for, that farming with nature is the way to sustain farming for the long term. And I mean, it's kind of an indictment on a systemic failure that farmers are thinking about what the return is in 12 months' time rather than 12 years' time or the next generation's time. And I think, it undermines that notion that we're all holding, that farmers are these stewards of the land and that they have this kind of long-term kind of responsibility, that you're saying, actually, if it's not going to benefit this particular arable field, then why am I doing it? And you go, well, you're doing it because you're looking after a shared asset, which is the land. There's not more of it. I can't go and buy some down the shop and do my own bit of land. This is something that is a shared endeavour. And there's, in the same way that looking after our water sources are. So I think we do need a system that supports that, and so that it changes the muscle memory, because you're right, it's 70 years of maximised production and then you are doing the right thing for society. And now we need to say, well, hang on a minute, if we keep drawing from the savings bank of nature, there's a certain point at which there will be none left, and then we are all screwed. Then production will fall through the floor, and it isn't just the pollinators directly adjacent to the cereal crop that probably doesn't need it. It's the whole ecosystem. You pull out enough bricks and the whole thing collapses. And it's naive to think that that isn't happening in other places in the world as well. And that we have that shifting baseline syndrome, don't we? That we look, even people who, are really, have literally the soil under their fingernails, it's hard to know that if you were standing, shoulder to shoulder with your grandfather or whoever was farming that land, 2 or 3 generations ago, 2 generations, it doesn't need to be that long ago, they would see a very different landscape, and they would see an incredibly depleted landscape and say, where have all the birds gone? Why is it so quiet? How come this soil looks like dirt rather than like a living soil? Why are there no birds following the plough? And I think fundamentally that's the challenge, isn't it? That because so many people, so many businesses are in that breathless, the debt is stacking up, you're thinking about how are we going to get to the end of the year? That it's hard to think for the long term because you're in such scarcity, fear, defence spaces. And that is not a criticism of any individual. And I really feel for the people who are going, I can't make the sums work, but I cannot give this business up. It's not like you can just, kind of fold the shop and say, we'll sell off the stock on eBay. That's not how farming works. So we need to make it work, but we need to make it work for the long term and for people beyond just the, land registry boundary of what farm holding you have, because the work is for more than just your business.
I couldn't agree more with all of that.
I'm going to come back to you in just a second, Joe, but I just wanted to sort of say that I think, within the current landscape around, what's happening with inheritance tax and all these other things that farmers are feeling that they're kind of under the cosh on, that they're, probably going to be a fair few of them that just think, oh, well, for goodness sake, sod this. I'm just going to go back to the way that I used to do things. And that's a real danger as well in terms of just sort of turning back the clock. But I just want to round this off, Joe, with a sort of question mark around whether there might be some good news on the horizon, because obviously the NFFN and the NFU have been calling for a 1-year rollover. I mean, Marianne talked about this systemic problem, and that's what Labour have been saying. Apart from anything else, they've been blaming the previous government for the lack of money and schemes that aren't continuous. But they've been there for more than a year now. That's not good enough, is it? There does need to be a rollover. Do we think? And sorry, just because we're recording this in a sort of slightly different chronology to when these go out, but by the time this conversation goes out, we will have discussed this on Martin's Farm. We will have had an emergency podcast with farmers from the Nature Friendly Farming Network talking about how it's going to affect them on their farms. Is there some good news possibly on the horizon?
Just first, before I broach that one, just very briefly, I agree with everything Marianne said there. And let me be clear: no one wants to do this. The challenge is that 6,000 farm businesses went out of business in the last 12 months alone. A record number. The decades now of underinvestment in our farming sector and of low commodity prices, and of challenging business conditions and of fluctuating policy are now catching. We have hit the cliff edge. It is happening. And the tragedy is that at the same time that climate change is badly impacting so many farm businesses, we've had this withdrawal of support for nature-friendly farming as well. And that is what is driving these bad decisions. But you can't blame a farmer for thinking, you know what, I've got to do everything I can to try and be able to be in business in 12 months' time. And that's what's driving these short-term decisions. So absolutely. And we have to find a way to convince government and the private sector to understand that this is an existential issue right now, as you say, for our whole of our ecosystem.
We need to move on, but good news on the horizon?
There are potential rumblings that DEFRA is considering the potential rollover of all the expiring, or at least some of the expiring agreements, coming up this end of this year. I would very much like to think so, because that is obviously an incredibly sensible, and it should be a no-brainer decision to allow farmers to continue the good work that they are doing for another 12 months until this policy chaos is hopefully behind us.
Fantastic. I'm going to move on and we'll go to a break in just a moment. But the last story that I wanted us to pick up on before we do is 80% of British people say that nature makes them feel not just happy, but very happy. And we're recording this, a couple of weeks after that big demonstration that was in London, which talked about Britain united, but really was a very polarizing demonstration built around a particular view of nationalism. So I think, when there is lots of doom and gloom, when there is lots of division that's taking place, whether you agree with, whichever side of that conversation you happen to be on, it's really good to see something positive that genuinely unites, absolutely the majority of people in Britain. And I'm just going to pick up a few things from this report. So this was a study of more than 7,000 people across England, Scotland and Wales. The report found nature matters deeply to people, that 4 in 5, 81% agree that being in nature makes them very happy. Almost all Britons expressing pride in environmental efforts such as tree planting, national park protection and recycling. That climate concern is also a unifier in a time of polarisation, that 74% of Brits believe climate change is important and only 4% say that they're not worried about it. Desire for strong leadership on this as well. Over half of Brits wanting strong and ambitious leadership on climate and nature, with 86% of Brits thinking that it's important that climate action should also protect nature and wildlife. Half of those, this is sort of the slight downside, half of those surveyed worried that their children's prospects are going to be worse than their own. And also sort of coming back to that whole cost of living thing, that people support climate action, but they really want climate action that is going to help them, now, as well as helping nature in the future. So the cost of living being a real concern, people wanting to see climate policies that lower their energy bills, with 74% of Brits believing climate policies are actually going to cost them money rather than help them save it. So there's some friction there between those two positions. But ultimately, there's an awful lot of people want to see concerted action on climate. 3/4 of people wanting to see that connected with nature as well, understanding that climate and nature work hand in hand. But again, it's that 4/5 of Britons being made really very happy by nature. Marianne.
It's a natural part of being Homo sapiens, that is our natural habitat, not to be in a high-rise flat like a battery chicken, under artificial lights, eating food from packets. It's our natural condition to be outside and surrounded by rich, abundant ecosystems. So it's kind of awesome that people recognise that and are able to say it. I think the thing we have to remember, though, is that the more opportunities people have to care and genuinely engage, so actually have access to green and blue spaces, the more important it goes from this kind of abstract notion where maybe you'll watch like a nice documentary or, buy a calendar with like landscapes, compared to the reality of living or visiting rural countryside. And I think that's the difference, because sometimes people have a kind of chocolate box. It's there. It's sort of a museum, a naturey museum place that has to be bucolic and pastoral and not make too much noise because it's nice, versus the reality, which is that we actually want a countryside that is a place for thriving businesses and rich multicultural communities that are inclusive and supportive. It's a place that people want to move to, as well as stay and live in, and actually have kind of fair access to services, to affordable housing, to good jobs and prospects. So I think it's a kind of combination of like, yes, it makes people happy, but how often do they, A, have access to nature, and how disproportionate and unfair is that access? And then when they're thinking about nature or thinking about the countryside particularly, what actually is it that they're thinking of? Is it museum or is it reality?
And Joe, I've always made the point, absolutely agree with everything that Marianne said there, but I've always made the point that, you know, the NFU and other farming organisations really ought to be talking up the way in which, you know, farmers have such an important role in terms of nature guardianship, in terms of making the case that there ought to be money going to farmers to help them do the best for nature, which of course goes back to that previous conversation around countryside stewardship. 4/5 of voters there believe that nature is making them very happy. Well, there's a cost associated with that.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, pretty much all organisations are now making the case that it's not just being out in nature; it's what healthy food can we produce and provide to people to reduce the strain on the NHS, on mental health, and on all the rest of it. Absolutely. So no, this is clearly a huge and evolving area. But again, at the minute, we're not even getting the basics right. We're not even able to put together a really small amount of money just to safeguard what we still have, let alone to start talking about how we can get more people out there, how we can change the food system to realize all the potential benefits. So yeah, we've got a lot of work to do, and yeah, conversations like this are, you know, a small part of that.
Yeah, and just, you know, finally on that, just you talked about it being a small amount of money that government, you know, puts out there to support farming and to support the way that farming interacts with nature. And just to reiterate those figures I've used before, that for every citizen in the UK, the government is putting in less than it costs to join the National Trust. So that's less than £1 a week per person that's going into preserving the nature on the farmer managed nature in these islands, which of course is 70% and more of the countryside of the land in Britain. We're going to go to a break, and when we come back, we're going to be talking about CPRE, rural development and building on brownfield. So cue music. And Joe, we're going to lose the whole of that sort of third section on vertical farms and all that sort of stuff. Is that all right?
Oh, I was looking forward to learning about vertical farms. Don't know anything about them. Is that pigs in high-rise flat?
Well, let's have it briefly anyway.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
no,
I know.
no,
Finlay's like, come on. Said that
right.
wasn't part of the thing we were talking
We're only
about.
going to talk about CPRE, but we're going to talk about vertical farms as well. And we're back, and we're joined by Marianne Hotter, the president of CPRE. And just in the break, I was talking about the things that we're going to cut because we're just not going to have time to talk about them here. And I mentioned that vertical farms was one of them. And Marianne came in and said, "Oh no, I wanted to learn about vertical farms." So we're going to talk about vertical farms briefly before we move on to CPRE. Joe, were we talking about great big pigs in high-rise blocks?
No, we're talking in the UK context very much about you know, using controlled atmosphere indoor environments to produce, you know, for the most part, sort of, you know, small greens and salad garnishes, that sort of thing, herbs, and yeah, I think the reason you want to talk about this, Finlay, was because a recent report suggested that actually in a vertical farming situation, even using solar energy, the carbon footprint of these sorts of, you know, small greens produced in such systems are actually potentially demonstrably higher than if we're growing them in an outdoor environment. And
it was the energy footprint particularly, wasn't it, that even with renewables, it was double the amount of it was double the amount of carbon emissions that were being produced.
You know, that's not the be all and end all of course, is it? You know, the in terms of the efficiency of water use, efficiency of nutrient use, the ability to have that controlled environment, so you've got guaranteed production, you've got guaranteed low levels of disease and pests, so you can have, you know, virtually no, if not no, synthetic you know, pesticides and chemicals in there, etc. So there's obviously huge benefits, but the problem, of course, is at the minute they can't even make the economic model work for those really fast growing, really low value commodities like, you know, herbs, etc. You know, sadly, you know, we're just seeing these things going bust left, right, and centre all around the world, including here in the UK. One of the world's largest vertical farms has just gone out of business earlier in 2025 because they just couldn't make the sums stack up. So the huge potential there, not to feed the world, but to potentially, you know, do some nice
to garnish
stuff
the world.
to garnish the world, indeed.
That's the main thing. And just sort of going back to the report, Joe, just to cut you off, you come back in a second, but the results were showing that in terms of the land footprint, if you're thinking of lettuce being produced in a tube station, an old tube station, they can get 20 times the yield, and of course they can manage the water and the nutrients more effectively. But if they weren't using, as it says, when renewables are not used, and instead the UK's grid electricity mix is applied, the carbon impact of vertically farmed lettuce rises to about 800% more than field-grown lettuce, and even with renewables, it was double.
Yeah. So, but ultimately, you can't have everything, right? There's always going to be trade-offs. But again, I mean, fundamentally, the problem we've got here is, people see governments, especially, they'll see vertical farms as, yes, a way to feed the world and to move away from conventional agriculture. The reality is that's not the conversation we're actually having, and also the business model, sadly, still doesn't seem to add up, even for what they can grow in these vertical farms. So, one for the future, clearly, but it's not really happening right now.
Thanks, Joe. Mary Ann, CPRE is the Campaign to Protect Rural England, rebranded as the Countryside Charity. Tell us about it and tell us about your role.
Yeah, so CPRE is all about having a passion for England's countryside, making it a better place for people to work, to live and to visit. And so what we do is we advocate for policies and culture shifts, I guess, that are going to enhance the future of the countryside. We publish policy and research to guide that conversation, and then we have practical work through our network of county branches as well. So we've got a big project called Hedgerow Heroes, where next year is our 100th anniversary, and the aim is to plant 100 miles of hedge across the country, because it's an amazing wildlife connector, shelter belt for kind of farmed land or pasture land, but also it's a way for people who perhaps do not work on the land to have an opportunity to get hands-on. And whenever you plant something, you're planting legacy, aren't you? So to really be part of the future of the countryside and feel invested that this is something that is ours wherever you live or work.
And you're the president.
I am, yeah. So it's an honorary role, and I was appointed in July 2024. And obviously it was the same week as the new government coming in. So there was kind of a big job of work. I think CPRE has traditionally been seen as perhaps a kind of a right-leaning organisation, kind of small c conservative and perhaps big C conservative. But the reality is, across our membership and supporter network and the organisations that we work in partnership with, I think we're a kind of very broad church in terms of politics. Our, aligning focus is what would make the countryside better for everyone. And why is it important? Making the case for why that's important.
Yeah, it's interesting because, of course, the way that different organisations are seen at a national level and a local level can often vary. And you and I started to have this conversation at Groundswell, which is, why we're having this conversation now. But there is a degree to which CPR's reputation is sort of as NIMBYs United. It's a sort of a walking, living, breathing version of the Daily Telegraph. And perhaps even more disparagingly, it could be Pensioner NIMBYs United. And I think you're
that's all the energy that I'm bringing. Definitely, yeah. Can you tell?
Yeah, and so I want you to push back on that to an extent, because what I found, when I've sort of interacted with CPRE in the past, when I was Chief Exec of Farmwell, before I was editor at 8.9, Graham Willis was your sort of rural advisor, farming advisor, and I found him one of the most sensible people that I was meeting anywhere. I had a huge amount of time for him. I thought his solutions were really interesting, really well informed. I thought he was absolutely fantastic. And yet, at a local level, when most people are coming across CPRE as an organisation, it will be a local group opposing something fairly vociferously and not always factually.
Yeah, I mean, there's a tension there, because sometimes people come to CPRE because they know that we are a charity with planning expertise, and can help individuals navigate what is a local plan, how do you engage with a planning system, and often people kind of come to that awareness when they sense or hear about something that's happening in their local area. Now, of course, I am pro-democracy, and so the more we have well-informed citizens who can take part in those democratic processes, of which kind of planning applications and planning hearings are a part of, but also are able and kind of confident and importantly armed with the facts, to kind of actually say, well, this is what do you want the countryside to look like? How do you want it to work? What would make a big difference in terms of where we put the energy infrastructure, where we build new homes? What do those homes look like? Who are they for, crucially? Things like, how important is food sovereignty? What is the important conversation around land use and what goes where? And I think the more empowered and more welcome people feel to be part of the conversation, I mean, it goes back to the conversation about kids on farms, the better quality of discussion we can have and the better outcomes, because you've got a more diversity of thought, you've got more curiosity, and people are more invested in the solutions that are then put forwards, because there's always going to be compromises and trade-offs. I mean, that's why something like the land use framework is so important as a sort of guiding principle that everybody can sign up to and say, this is going to help us streamline and get more coherence around the decisions we make. Because when you decide to put one thing there, whether it's ground mounted solar, whether it's a vertical farm, whether it's an urban extension of a town to house another, 200,000 people, you're making a decision about what is going to be there, and you're making a decision about what is not going to be there and how the whole system works. So some of the work that we do around farming, for example, we recently published a report on peri-urban farming. So the farmland that is right adjacent to urban and suburban areas. And one of the things that's really striking is that there is a much lower uptake of the higher tier countryside stewardship in lowland, predominantly lowland, peri-urban farmland. And that in itself is kind of telling, because maybe you go, well, it's because it's productive, like grade 1 or 2 land, and people aren't really bothered about planting strips for, arable birds. They're going to just crack on and do as much wheat as possible. But then the question is that's actually the countryside next door for the vast majority of the population. And that impacts access to that, the quality of that, how much it's working hard to, for example, clean water, store water in the landscape, protect from flooding, reduce heating and wildfire risk, all that stuff that's happening, adjacent to where all the people are. So it's all well and good having some amazing scheme that impacts the uplands, like the farming and protected landscapes. Often that's the national landscapes, that's the national parks. A lot of those landscapes are places where people visit, but actually the resident population is relatively low. We need to turn our attentions and care and money and investment to the peri-urban farmland as well.
Yeah, and really interesting. And just sort of whipping back to that NIMBY sort of idea, what I heard you saying, I think, was that often people at a local level will come to you because they're angry about something, because they're worried about something that's going up. And what your role is, or what CPRE's role is, to support them, but then to translate that action, that anger, into something which is much more positive action, for the countryside more broadly.
I see my role as making the case for CPRE being a place where we can really clearly and confidently say, that's great, let's do more of that, this is why, and actually build consensus around that. At the moment, I think our inheritance is that we are quite good at saying, no, not that, and here's why. And in the kind of the 100 years history of the charity, which is pretty awesome. I mean, the charity has done a lot of really cool stuff. Had a significant part in helping to establish the national parks, for example, making sure there wasn't a motorway that went through Styhead Tarn in the Lake District. But often the celebrated wins are the things that we managed to stop happening. And we actually need to change that to being a real powerful advocate for what good looks like. And that is the hill that I will die on.
And access seems to play quite an important part in that. You're talking about those sort of peri-urban landscapes, those landscapes that are, immediately adjacent to Bristol or Birmingham or London, where, people need to have access in order that they can get out there and value nature, value the countryside. But of course, that countryside needs to be accessible and it needs to be beautiful.
I mean, I'm less fussed about beautiful because I think it's subjective, and often that is kind of wielded as a reason to say, and therefore we can't have houses here. And you go, well, people do need to live. We do have a housing crisis in England, in the whole of the UK. But the crucial thing is, where do we build it and what are we building? And at the moment we have a really imbalanced kind of unhealthy system where the vast majority of housing delivery is built by provided by the volume house builders, who are operating on a market model where profit is their focus. And we've got a legislative system that supports that extraction of profit. And so the focus isn't to build homes for people that are affordable in places that they need them. At the moment, the focus of the market is to enable building, and the details of that get lost in the conversation. And the problem is that, those big house builders have massive pockets. They can bank land, they can sit on capital, they can sit on losses. They have no intention of reducing house prices because that reduces their profits.
Let's come on to houses in just a moment, houses and homes. But just before we do, Joe, have you had any particular experience of CPRE?
I must admit, in my little farming world, and I've not, to my shame. But yeah, I've been obviously aware of what work CPRE does, but I've never personally sort of had any interaction.
You've not had a local group sort of being active in any way around you.
And I don't know whether that means we're doing something right or doing something wrong. So I would be delighted to, Marianne.
Okay. I think that would be wonderful. Every autumn we have a countryside day as well, and next year it's our centenary. So if there are folk listening who want to get involved and say, actually, let's open the farm up, or let's work to support a Hedgerow Heroes project or something like that, we would love to hear from you. Because I think one of the other things that we can do as well is help act as an intermediary as well between government, but also between the wider population and the farming community. Because people are lonely. Like, farming is a socially isolating industry these days. Again, go back 2 generations and there were dozens of people in a field and working around the yard, and now there might be just one operator and a contractor when it gets busy, and then they bugger off to go and do a job for 20 other farms. And actually it means that farmers and people and growers as well aren't part of their local community, and they don't have as many opportunities, and the local community don't have as many opportunities to interact with farmers, and that doesn't serve either community well. So I think partly access, responsible access, is really important, and farmers should be supported to provide access and feel like it's a thing that they're supported in a way that gives them confidence that they can know what's going on, that they don't feel like it's out of control, that they're going to be overrun by, I don't know, loose dogs or litter or what have you. But in a way
need to sort of extend that open farm Sunday idea so that it becomes, as you're saying, more opportunities throughout the year for people to come on and be positive and engage, in controlled ways, because it helps people to understand how they can enjoy the countryside themselves when, they're not in a controlled situation, how to, behave responsibly on hills and footpaths and that sort of thing. And just fortuitously, we've had you booked on this podcast for a little while now, Marianne, and I'm not sure if it was for this reason that you put your report out this week. I'm sure it wasn't. But there was a report that came out from CPRE in this last week, and our headline was half of government's new homes target could be delivered rapidly on brownfield sites. So just the first couple of paragraphs here. New research from CPRE reveals that more than half of brownfield sites had some full or in principle planning permission in 2024, meaning that they could be built on, not just built on, but built on rapidly. The charity says that the UK's huge supply of brownfield land should be the first choice for building the homes that the country desperately needs. These sites are typically located near existing infrastructure such as public transport, schools, healthcare facilities, making them ideal. Furthermore, CPRE's calculations show there's enough brownfield land to build 1.4 million homes in England, based on data from local planning authorities. Most updated brownfield land registers up to 2024. So importantly, the key message really is that prioritising brownfield sites would allow for quicker timelines compared to greenfield developments. It can also minimise the environmental impact. Good timing. Tell us a bit more about that.
So obviously the government have this massive target. They've pinned their colours to the mast on building 1.5 million homes before the end of this Parliament, which, I mean, you don't need to be a housing expert to know that that is going to be a reach. What's important is that we have a really well-informed conversation about where those homes are built and what homes they are. So they need to be affordable homes. They need to be in places where there is a genuine local need for more homes. And it feels like a no-brainer, right? You look at the kind of the map, the coloured in map of England, and you say, well, where would you build the homes? Are you going to put them here on agricultural land or land that could be managed for nature, flood mitigation, all the rest of it? Or are you going to put them here on the site that used to be an old factory, which is actually close to the train station, close to services, there's energy connection already? And the challenge is that build them on the brownfield sites. Build them on the brownfield sites in a way that is nature rich, that is a way that is really good for people and creates places, communities that people want to live in. Now, the reason that folk go for the companies go for the greenfield is because you can sort of do it with more certainty that you're not going to come across an old gas pipe that you need to remediate before you keep building. But this is where the market needs to be controlled, because otherwise we will live in the English equivalent of Los Angeles, where suburb sprawl just carries on into the countryside. And you go, well, what else is that land supposed to be doing if it's not under a suburban housing estate of identikit little boxes?
Marianne, when I think
that are all car dependent as well. So actually densify around public transport, create active travel networks, have places that are lovely to live in and community focused, and people absolutely want to live there. But crucially as well, we need to make sure that they're affordable homes. So at the moment, the definition of an affordable home, when you talk about like a percentage of affordable housing, it's 80% of the market value of homes in that local area. Now, 80% of completely unaffordable executive 5-bedroom house that's like 800 grand is still completely unaffordable for loads and loads of people. So CPRE are calling for the definition of affordability to change so that it's actually linked to local wages rather than market house prices. And that would have a huge impact on rural communities, because across the whole country, rural wages are lower. And there are lots of people listening to this will know that actually the house prices are pitched for urban incomers or people with a second home, or they want to buy to let, or it's an investment property. And local people are completely priced out. You know, we've got 28,000 people in rural English counties, constituencies, who are homeless. We've got a waiting list of 300,000 people for social housing. But what's happening is that rural local authorities aren't building houses, partly because there's an uncertainty around where to build them and how to build them. But there's also those big house builders are like, well, you know, I don't really want to build 15 houses as a tiny little village infill. I want to build 10,000 on the outskirts of Wolverhampton, thanks very much. And actually what we need to do is kind of change the whole system of the market so that small and medium enterprise builders actually do step up, or community-owned building cooperatives go, where we need the houses is here, so we can keep the primary school open, so we do have carers and nurses and teaching assistants and labourers who are living in communities that they are serving and part of.
Marianne,
so it's kind of systemic change, isn't it?
I don't think there's, I completely agree with you around that need for key workers and lowering that or changing that definition of affordability to sort of link it to wages rather than just 80% of the most expensive, houses or the average houses, which tend to be, really quite expensive. The question I wanted to ask you about, though, was around sort of brownfield versus greenfield. If I think of my village, then on the edge of my village, there are fields which are essentially just monocultures of ryegrass with very little nature value. Whereas, if you're going into sort of some more inner city areas, then those brownfield sites that have been left derelict perhaps for, 20, 30 years have got some really quite high nature value.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It has to be to some extent on a case by case basis, because you're right. There's industrial sites. There's a site in Tilbury which is full of this thing called pulverized fuel ash, which is basically like industrial waste that has been dumped. But now it's this amazing, thriving community of really quite rare invertebrates, butterflies and dragonflies and beetles and all sorts of stuff. And you kind of go, oh, well, it's kind of scuzzy. That's the problem with beauty. Scrub is a perfect example of no one really wants a calendar of pictures of scrub. Mm-hmm. But it's super important in terms of how an ecosystem works and where the nightingales are going to live, and where you've got these kind of corridors of nature connection through our landscape so that actually species can shift as the climate changes. All this stuff is super important. But then you kind of look at that greenfield, Finlo, and you say, okay, well, it's a monoculture, it's nature poor, but could it be nature rich? Could it be farmed in a different way that is still producing, but also is supporting and restoring nature? And if so, maybe we should be putting in your village an additional 7 houses in that funny little bit behind where the garages are that people don't really use very much. Yeah, now that's going to be trickier because there's a kind of narrow lane and there's not the economy of scale of like raising a huge bit of Lincolnshire and building, identikit boxes. But we need to kind of hope for, we need to aim for better. The minimum bar of building slums for the future isn't something that we should be proud of. That should be something that, in 100 years' time, will we be proud of what we did in 2021 to 2025 to 2030? Or are we going to be, or are our grandchildren going to go, what were they doing? And I would much rather advocate for good.
Let me give you a couple of anecdotes. As behind me, there was, a couple of acres of wasteland that was really, beautifully high nature value. Lots and lots of stuff going on there. Huge amount, really diverse wildflowers, loads of insects and birds and other things. And some people came in from London. They decided they were going to buy it from the developer that hadn't managed to develop it for years and years and years. They've ploughed it out and just replaced it with ryegrass, and it's an absolute desert. And that's because people are sort of coming in, and their view of what the countryside should be is that it's green rather than messy, which is a huge problem in terms of nature. But then we've been involved in, as many communities will be around Britain at the moment, in zoning conversations. So the Dorset Council has wanted every village to sort of think about where in that village or around that village might be suitable for housing. And so we had a great big public meeting with a couple of hundred people in the village hall earlier this week. And there were very few voices basically saying, look, where you've chosen, where you've identified to build some houses looks like a really good place to build some houses. And I think, there was me saying that, and possibly 2 or 3, and one of those was my son. Everybody else was really just against the idea of homes really being built anywhere. And there were some quite vociferous voices saying, well, we should be a special case. We're a particularly nice village. We don't want any houses built here. They can go somewhere else. And this is a challenge, isn't it? And so the question really from that is, is CPRE in favour of any development? And I think it is. You've just talked about some of that. I was surprised that I think CPRE are even proposing that new towns in some place would be a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the oh wait, I don't know when this is going to come out. Will the new town? So there's probably going to be a new towns announcement next week. So will that have already been?
So this will just about be out.
Okay, so we've got the government's new towns announcement, and CPRE are entirely behind it because we do have a housing crisis that we need to tackle. The crucial focus, the goal, is build it well and build it in the right place, rather than be entirely beholden to profit-making enterprises who are going, don't worry, we'll build it for you. And what they will build is what suits them and their bottom line, not what suits us as a society.
Because everywhere is important to somebody. So how do you choose that right place?
It is really important that we help people understand the issues in a broader context. And again, we go back to that kind of, we're not inviting outrage, we're inviting understanding, and then a kind of a synthesis of ideas where we can all back the solutions. Even if you go, well, that's not exactly what I want, but I can understand the logic and the rationale. I trust that the system has worked to deliver a good outcome for us as a community, or us as a society, or us as a nation. So in terms of where new towns should go, we should be looking at places like urban extensions, where you've got kind of nature corridors or kind of encircling nature, whether you want to call that a green belt or not, I don't mind. We should be looking at communities that are not built to be entirely car dependent. So you've got a massive main road, you've got those suburban streets, and then really dispersed kind of low density housing that sprawls, because the more land you take for housing, the less land you have to do all the other things that we need land to do. So it's there's a kind of a term in urbanism called gentle density, or gentle densification. So, for example, around a train station, you could say, well, actually, we're going to have some mansion blocks. We're going to have terraced houses, because that's a way of densifying how many houses or how many homes are in a particular given acreage of land, but in a way that makes people feel like they're part of a community rather than intensively farmed animals next to a kind of a bus stop. So there's ways to kind of create a place that feels like it has all the things that are important for a good life. So access to education, access to nature, access to active travel, places that are going to actually enrich our health, our economy, make us happier and healthier and more prosperous, rather than sicker and sadder and poorer. And we are at a crossroads where we're deciding, because we've got this commitment, the government has this commitment to build 1.5 million homes. And we as a nation are at the point where we're kind of going to go, okay, yeah, just build them, it doesn't matter how, or let's build communities that we're going to be proud of, that are going to make us a healthier, happier and more prosperous nation.
Joe, thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the fundamental problem, I think, with this, I think we've talked about, things like solar before, right? The problem is fundamentally that if we're trying to do everything as cheaply as we possibly can, you're not generally going to end up with the best outcomes. And I guess it's much the same here. As Marianne was saying, the problem with developing brownfield sites is that it's going to cost you more than to just build it on a green field. And whilst our economy really only values the cheapest and most efficient way of doing anything, we're not generally going to get good outcomes. That's whether you're talking about housing development or whether you're talking about food production, right?
And the truth is, with the brownfield sites, the government have announced this brownfield passport scheme. So in principle, that there's a default of planning application and that you would get a yes. So if you bring a scheme that meets the design codes of the area, that kind of fits the requirements of that local area, the default is that absolutely you're going to get planning permission, you can get shovels in the ground, so that you're not in a situation which at the moment the system sort of rewards just kind of discretionary case by case planning applications that then get rejected, and then there's an appeal, and then there's a kind of tinkering of the plan, and then it goes back, and people don't trust the planning system, rightly, because it is inefficient and it feels really opaque, and there's this kind of black box answer that comes out and people go, well, how did that get consented and this thing didn't? It doesn't make any sense to folk. I think what we need to do is make it much clearer, much more transparent, and definitely more efficient. But that isn't by reducing regulation. It's by making it much easier to build the things that we want developers to build, and much harder for them to build the things that we do not want them to build.
So
And
if I was to
when you
summarise
talk to
this a
people,
little
you
bit,
go, great, that sounds like absolute common sense. Why aren't we doing that already? And I, as president of CPRE, go, I know, that's what we're advocating for.
So just finally, I want to sort of, try and summarise the position of CPRE around this, around the idea of development, not just in terms of homes and houses, but development more broadly. And what it seems to me that you're saying is that we should be developing communities rather than simply building buildings, that you're after gentle densification, I think was the phrase that you used. And if there is that sort of field on the edge of a village, then yeah, there could be some houses there, but not on every field around every village. And we need to make sure that we find ways, going back to that initial conversation we had around countryside stewardship, that there are ways of funding proper farming, food, fibre production that's integrated with nature and makes those, really good fields in a good countryside landscape.
Absolutely, because that works for farmers, that works for the UK PLC bottom line, and it works for people.
Fantastic. Joe, any final thoughts on this?
No, again, I agree. I mean, it's just all about creating a better world, isn't it? And just going back to my previous thoughts, the problem we just seem to have is cheapest at all costs, and we need to be looking at a better way of doing everything in society and valuing things other than the sort of the bottom of the barrel price.
Fantastic. Look, we're going to have to end there. We've gone way over time. We've missed a whole bunch of things that we're going to talk about, including things that I wanted to talk to you about CPRE, Mary-Ann. So maybe, at some point in the future, you can come back and talk to us about other sort of elements, maybe when that new town, when those new towns are being planned and we actually have a sense of where they are, and to talk about solar and a range of other things as well. But that's it. That is the time that we have. Thanks, Joe. Thank you to our guest, Mary-Ann OCHOTA from CPRE. If you've enjoyed listening, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, review us, and share our links. Farmgate is the highest ranking UK podcast for regen farming and food security. Farmgate leaders and nature-friendly Farmgate, now called Martin's Farm, are available if you just scroll back in your podcast feed. Farmgate is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel, which is sponsored by First Milk, Pelican Ag, Rural Solutions, the Usk Catchment Partnership, Agrolo, and individual donors. I've been FFINLO COSTAIN. Bye for now.
And I've been Joe Stanley.